don't think people have really hoisted home the fact that this is a genocidal war crimes attack on a children's hospital and a maternity hospital, implemented and executed by the current chair of the United Nations Security Council, and therefore a signatory to the UN Charter on Human Rights. I mean, it is disgusting. It is beyond disgusting.
Let's bring in General Sir Richard Shirreff, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Good afternoon to you, Sir Richard.
Good afternoon.
What do you make of what we heard from Sir Patrick Sanders then? Do you think that he's right? And indeed, Sir Nick Carter seemed to take the same view. We basically don't have the forces to fight a war.
He's right, but he's not the first person to be saying this. If you look back, this is exactly what I was saying 10 years ago. And this has been a constant theme. And I'm afraid to say that even during the, Nick Carter may be saying that we're not ready to fight a war, but I would ask what was he doing when he was Chief of Defense Staff? Because quite clearly, the message then was we were not able to fight. We're way behind the curve. And I'm afraid that even 2.5% of GDP won't put us into a position ready to fight a war. We need a massive splurge of cash, which is, of course, in seriously short supply, and a fundamental mindset shift that says we've got to be ready to do this.
Yeah, Sir Patrick Sanders saying we should spend closer to 3%. Is that the sort of figure that you think that the new government should be trying to reach?
It's probably a minimum, because what's got to start? You've got to start by establishing, it's all very well bandying percentages of GDP around. You've got to look at the output you get from that, and that's going to require a fundamental reappraisal of the way defense does its business, procures its weaponry. It's going to require mobilization of defense industries, but above all, it's going to require a very close analysis of what is wrong, where are the gaps, set against the requirements of 21st century conflict, and the lessons of what we're seeing in Ukraine in terms of the need for mass and presence. And then you've got to try and work out the sums on how you match the requirement to what's available.
And of course, that devastating attack in Ukraine yesterday, including the strike on a children's hospital in Kyiv, just underlines the urgency of all of this. But we do know that the incoming government is going to hold a defence and strategic security review. I mean, is that a good first step, or is there a danger that that just means that any decisions get delayed?
Well, firstly, you're absolutely right about the attack in Kiev, and I don't think people have really hoisted home the fact that this is a genocidal war crimes attack on a children's hospital and a maternity hospital, implemented and executed by the current chair of the United Nations Security Council, and therefore a signatory to the UN Charter on Human Rights. I mean, it is disgusting. It is beyond disgusting. And this should really focus the NATO summit on the only outcome that is going to sort this out, which is defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And that is what the aim should be. That is what NATO should be aiming to support Ukraine in achieving defeat of Russia. Now, that means a mindset shift. Absolutely, it needs a mindset shift. Time is short, but to answer the essence of your question, you can't start sorting out the problems until you're quite clear about the problems, what they are. So I think it is right to conduct a defense review, but it's got to be a defense review, a wartime defense review, conducted against very tight timelines, and with a clear remit to sort out the problems, identify the problems, and come up with solutions. And for my money, I would be shutting up the chiefs and all the joint staffs and the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force staffs in the Defense Academy, and throwing away the key and telling them you've got 4 weeks to sort it out, and you're not going home until you have.
Do you think it's going to be difficult for Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, going out there to NATO to try to play a leading role and get some kind of unified commitment to continuing to support Ukraine when we have this background of a lack of defence spending on our own armed forces?
Well, there will be, I suspect, a warm welcome for our new prime minister, um, because of what he represents in terms of a new broom, and that, my goodness me, is needed after the last 14 years. But equally, it's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another thing to walk it. And people will be watching and waiting to see where the substance is, and that's the only thing that counts: is what is the substance that Britain can bring to the party.
And just finally, on that NATO summit, do you think that there does need to be some kind of further long-term commitment in terms of what actual hardware they're going to give to Ukraine? Because President Zelensky is going to be there. He's going to be stressing the need in particular for more air defences.
Yeah, NATO has got to do what NATO is set up to do, which is to think strategically about defense and security. There needs to be, number one, recognition that the only way to achieve peace and security in the transatlantic region, the Euro-Atlantic region, against a Russia that is determined to build another Russian empire, determined to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state, and will present an ever-present security threat. The only way to achieve peace, therefore, is for NATO to establish a band of deterrent steel around Eastern Europe to include Ukraine as a NATO member. And the only way you're going to get there is first by defeating Russia, Ukraine defeating Russia in Ukraine. And once that has happened, then NATO can admit Ukraine.
Okay.
All the talk about hardware and that sort of thing, that's important. But it's got to be done as part of a strategic plan which lays out the strategy that I've just outlined.
Sir Richard Shirreff, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Really good to speak to you. Thanks so much. Well, let's now speak to Fabrice Potier. He is a former Director of Policy Planning at NATO who worked with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and Anders Fogh Rasmussen beforehand. Good afternoon to you, Fabrice.
Good afternoon.
Do you think that at this NATO summit, there should be agreement on a process for allowing Ukraine to join?
I think before answering, you have to put that into a broader context. The real question that the NATO leaders need to ask themselves when they arrive in this summit is, do they want to celebrate history or do they want to make history? I think celebrating history is somehow pretty straightforward. It involves a nice photo op, nice statement about the strength of the alliance for 75 years. But making history is obviously a different scale of commitment and ambition. However, it's what is needed when you look at the kind of threats and adversaries that the broader Western community is facing. And at the center of that, that's where I come back to your question, is Ukraine. Unless, as the previous interviewee said, unless we are to include Ukraine into the alliance in order to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty for the long haul, we are going to keep on having war at the edges of the alliance and possibly even war creeping inside the alliance. So yes, I do think that it is critical if you want to make history and have the West more in the driving seat, that Ukraine becomes a member of the NATO.
There will be a huge focus on Joe Biden, on his frailty. As you know, that some even in his own party are now questioning whether he's the one to stop Donald Trump. Do you think that adds a greater urgency to these calls that we're already hearing, particularly from some Eastern European nations, to Trump-proof NATO, to put in place long-term commitments so that if Trump does return to the White House after the presidential election, there are binding commitments there for helping Ukraine?
I think first, I would not want to comment on President Biden's health, but I think I will want to comment on the health of his policies. And the frailty you see maybe in the person is also the frailty you see in his own Ukraine policy, where indeed the US has expended a great deal of resources. It's undeniable, but it's clearly not enough. And the attack yesterday by the despicable attack by the Russians against a children's hospital is another evidence that good enough is not enough to get through the winning finishing line for Ukraine. We have a strategy of avoiding defeat for Ukraine, but we don't have a strategy of winning, simply because President Biden and few other NATO leaders are scared of a Russian defeat. And because they cannot contemplate that notion, therefore they're constantly asking the Ukrainians to fight with their one arm basically tied in their back. So I will more be critical about President Biden's frailty of his own Ukraine policy. As to the broader question, I think this is obviously about the Trump-proofing NATO. I think Trump-proofing might be a thing, but the key is whether we can be compatible with a Trump administration. And here it's not just about protecting NATO, protecting some NATO spending priorities, but it's about showing whoever is going to be in the Oval Office on the 6th of January, about showing that basically Europe is ready to defend itself and to defend Europe, and not just to talk about Europe and defense and still be dependent on the United States. And I think that's the key thing that falls on the NATO leaders.
And how important do you think could be the role for our new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer? He's made it clear that he wants to continue Britain's commitment, its support to Ukraine, and we've been providing weapons and equipment and training, and Sir Keir Starmer has made it very clear he wants to continue that. There are questions about Britain's defence forces, but do you think that despite that, Sir Keir Starmer can play a leading role in trying to get these kind of commitments and agreements across the alliance?
I think he can, even though, like you underlined, there is a real tension between the strategic priority of supporting Ukraine. And here we need to commend the United Kingdom's governments for having done so over the years, and having often led the way to big decisions on weapons systems, but also political decisions, including NATO membership and security guarantees. However, there is a tension, obviously, to reconcile this with the defense spending priorities, where obviously the UK MOD is under great strain. And it is true that the UK arsenal is pretty much hollow. So there's a lot of rebuilding to do at home, but you should not lose your eyes also of the commitment abroad. And I think the new Prime Minister has a real opportunity to show that the United Kingdom is a European power, and is committed to its to basically its level of ambition when it comes to Eastern Europe. So I would hope that it is going to be more than just business as usual, but that there could be even an increase in the UK commitment, which does not have to be quantitative only. It can also be qualitative. And here, I mean, especially on the Ukraine membership to NATO, which is one key ingredient to finish this war on acceptable terms.
Fabrice Potier, former Director of Policy Planning at NATO. Thanks so much for joining us.